This is One in Five, a podcast from Providence about disability and the intersections with healthcare. I'm Angela Marith.
And I'm Sarah Quinto. On today's episode, exploring the common thread among people with disability of being disbelieved when seeking care.
When we first started teeing up this idea of a podcast, Sarah, you had recommended that I watch this documentary called Crip Camp, and the name itself made me uncomfortable and kind of surprised me. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the documentary.
Yeah, and I just love that it made you uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah, just because, I think sometimes disability, there's a lot of ways people look at disability, but making other people uncomfortable is kind of part of what we do, it's like, and the word itself, it's a play on the word cripple, and it's a reclaimed word in the disability community, similar to other sort of reclaimed words in other communities. And it's just such an incredibly powerful documentary because, the way that it starts is all of these disabled kids for the first time kind of coming together in community up in a camp in the Catskills. And, you see them playing baseball together, you see them dating, you see them figuring out meal schedules.
It's so playful.
Yeah, I mean, it's kids being kids.
I loved music. I loved life. I wanted to be part of the world, but I didn't see anyone like me in it. And then I hear from some people about the summer camp. It's a summer camp for, the handicapped run by hippies. And somebody said, you probably will smoke dope with the counselors. And I'm like, sign me up. The wild thing is that this camp changed the world. And nobody knows this story.
There's something happening here. But what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there. Telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
Yeah, and then one thing led to another, and these kids built a movement. They called it a disability revolution. And as I just continued watching, the movie features Judy Heumann, who played a very important role in advocating for change. And at one point, she said, when she was advocating for change, she said, "I wish you would stop shaking your head at me in agreement." And there was something about that statement that I thought, we have to name a episode after that. And so we did.
We're going to listen to an excerpt of Judy Heumann. We call her the mother of the disability rights movement. She passed away recently and was a wheelchair user and an educator. So the clip we're going to listen to is her speaking at the Health, Education, and Welfare Office, better known as HUE, and it's 1977. So in 1977, there are these series of nonviolent civil disobedience takeovers in federal buildings across the country. So the longest of which was in San Francisco. And in these buildings, in the San Francisco building, there was over 100 protesters. Many people don't know this piece of disability history is actually the longest nonviolent sit-in.
Wow.
Yeah, it's the longest nonviolent sit-in in a federal building in U.S. history as well. So what they're asking for is there was this legislation that had come out. It was called 504. And it was to increase accessibility for disabled people in places like libraries, public transit, buses and trains, courtrooms, universities, and healthcare as well. And it was enacted in 1973, but for 4 years, it was on the desk of this person who worked for HUE, Joseph Califano. He was refusing to sign it. And so it couldn't be put into law. And so Judy Heumann and others go to Washington, D.C. to meet with Joseph Califano. This is on the heels of these big civil disobedience protests. And he was the one who was charged with signing the regulations. And what we're going to listen to is an excerpt of her speaking to him in a room of other disabled people who are also trying to push HUE to sign these regulations. So let's listen to it.
I can tell you that every time you raise issues of separate but equal, the outrage of disabled individuals across this country is going to continue. It is going to be ignited. There will be more takeovers of buildings until finally maybe you begin to understand our position. We will no longer allow the government to oppress disabled individuals. We want the law enforced. We want no more segregation. We will accept no more discussion of segregation. And I would appreciate it if you would stop shaking your head in agreement when I don't think you understand what we are talking about.
The thing that gets me about listening to this clip, there's so many things that stand out to me, but one of them is just her emotion. You can hear her voice cracking and she's upset and she's basically holding back tears, right? And it's because she's so frustrated. They've had to fight so hard and be dismissed for so long. And here she is in front of this person who is doing the same thing that she's had to fight for her entire life, and basically saying what's happening in this conversation is he's saying, well, the problem with 504 is if we sign it, it's going to create a lot of costs and it's going to cost a lot of money. And we don't want to do this and we don't want to do that. And she's saying, hey, wait a minute, stop it. This matters to our community and we need this signed. And the other thing is a lot of people, like when you hear this clip, a lot of people stop before she makes the shaking your head at me comment. But to me, that's the thing that really gets me about this is the sort of dismissiveness on the other end from Joseph Califano and the dismissiveness that she's having to encounter. What did you think when you listened to it?
This time when I listened to it, I really heard separate but equal, because those words have been used in different, ways that we dismiss many other communities in our history. And I didn't know until, and I don't remember listening to that part of it the very first time I watched this documentary, but it really hit home today, like how similar this movement is to many other civil rights movements in our history and how little we talk about it.
It's hidden history in a lot of ways. I think that the thing too about it is that, people had to fight for it, right? Like it was not going to happen unless there were literal takeovers of federal buildings and there were empowered disabled people that were willing to stand up for their own civil rights here. I think what's interesting is, I was thinking about this morning, is that a lot of times, I think you and I experience this, right? Like we'll be in a room with healthcare leaders and they'll say to us, yeah, this is so important, right? Like disability, right? It's so important. And I'm with you on that. And then you ask people to do something.
Yeah.
Right? And that's where it stops.
That's the scary part.
That's the scary part, right? So
I'm already doing so much. Or I don't understand how to do that, or you want me to do what? Yeah.
But I think that what's really upsetting about it is sometimes it's not even a big thing, right? Like I was listening to this story of a healthcare provider that's a little person, and she made a reasonable accommodation request to her employer, which was to have a stool provided because she needed it for the types of procedures she was doing. And it was declined.
Oh, wow.
Because it was too expensive. A stool, right? Like $30 from, your local hardware store.
Right.
And she was like, I'm going to die on this hill, right? Like this is not unreasonable and I'm making this request, but that's the difference, right? So someone will smile to your face and say, yes, 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 which is what is happening in this clip we listened to. And then on the other hand, when you ask them to follow through, even if it's not that expensive, there's this discrimination that you receive in return. Yeah.
Right. So, Sarah, all of this effort happened and 504 was passed. There were other regulations that are passed. We have regulations in healthcare now. There must be a lot of huge changes that have happened for people with disability now.
You would think that things would be much better, but there was a need, and this recently just came through. So there was a revision to the 504 regulations that was recently signed, and you have to understand, like, this 504 was signed 50 years ago, and there were still no strong enforceable standards to prohibit discrimination within healthcare. And now we have them, right? So we have standards for web and mobile accessibility, accessible medical equipment.
You mean in this new revision, we have this?
Mm-hmm. It's incredibly meaty and it's incredibly necessary. And I just really hope that healthcare is ready for it and ready to roll up our sleeves, because that's really what's needed. There were dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of disability advocates that made it happen. I think, though, we still have a long way to go, and we have not fully addressed attitudes within healthcare. Mm-hmm. The new 504 regulations will only be as good as they are enforced and they are adopted.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. So, like, now we have these new amendments. That's great. But does that mean our institutions will actually adhere to these new rules?
I mean, it's a fair question, right? So the enforcement piece for all kinds of civil rights legislation is something that many different advocates talk about. I keep thinking about it as two sides of a magnet too, right? Like, you have these regulations, but it has to have a connection point on the other side. People that are willing to take these and make the work happen inside of health systems. And to my knowledge, we don't have accessibility or disability inclusion as a priority population in most health systems. You don't have, say, like, someone who's exclusively looking at how to make healthcare more accessible or how to be more inclusive to people with disabilities. And certainly we don't have people whose job it is to consistently look at disability discrimination on attitudes basis, or provide education around that.
Right.
And I think part of it is that, healthcare, one of the challenges we have in healthcare is that, it's very challenging for providers with disabilities to be within healthcare. It's very challenging to have accommodations met. There's also a lot of stigma against disabilities, especially among doctors and nurses, where you're expected to have a sort of physical stature or, stamina. And, there's this grind culture, which incidentally is leading to burnout as well, right? So it's very challenging to bring people with disabilities into healthcare. And so when you don't have that workforce inside of healthcare saying, hey, we need to change these things, then you often miss things. Things get overlooked.
Yeah, there's this concept of cultural concordance when we're talking about racial equity in healthcare, where people feel more comfortable when they have a provider that looks like them, that has cultural experiences similar to them, and they can understand and empathize with them in different ways. So if we're not allowing the inclusion and the accessibility of people with disability to go into those careers, there is no chance for any sort of cultural concordance. So this makes me wonder about attitudes. You mentioned stigma. So, we have these regulations, but we also have to have, our mindset change, right? To implement and make it better.
Yeah, I think that that's really true. One piece is, I think often one of the things we talk about in the disability community is the sort of access component, right? Curb cuts, captions, even the accessible medical equipment question. There is this other piece of the iceberg, right? Which is, how do physicians relate to people with disabilities? What do they think about people with disabilities and their quality of life? Mm-hmm. What do they believe is possible for their patients? What are they overlooking because all they see is a disability or because they ignore the disability? So earlier in the series, you'll remember we heard from Devin Stahl, and we were both so enthralled with everything that she had to say and share. I wanted to play something else from her talk with you today, and let's listen to it because I think it really highlights what we've been talking about.
Don't assume that all people with disabilities are suffering from their disabilities. Don't assume that all people with disabilities want a cure for their disability. That kind of, sometimes we call this the curative imaginary. They're like, oh, who wouldn't want a cure? I often actually get this question, which is like, if there was a magic pill that made your MS go away, wouldn't you take it? And if I say yes, they go, gotcha, you hate disability too. I'm like, whoa, that's people love that magic pill question. So there are certain kinds of disabilities for which, when I talk to people, they'll tell me, of course, sometimes my life is really difficult and I'd rather not experience it. But when I say that out loud, people go, see, disability is terrible, right? And that's not the whole of their experience either, because there are many gifts that also come with that disability. And so the tension there is real. But when you say it to an audience for whom the automatic assumption is that it's terrible, you have to be really guarded about what you say is difficult in your life, because that will be used as a weapon against you, right? So when you hear people sort of, I've been like romanticizing disability, it's because the dominant cultural narrative is so negative that, you know, you have to say something more positive because you have to reveal that side of it too. So there are, of course, always two sides to this. But what our culture doesn't tolerate well, they love the like inspiration stuff, but they don't love the like disability pride stuff. It just baffles people, right? So I think we're not quite at the place yet where a lot of disabled people are willing to talk about the struggles because they don't want it to be weaponized against them.
Sarah, she says if you say something is difficult, it will be used as a weapon against you.
Right. And this whole thing of like, oh, you hate disability too. You know, if you say you want a cure, that means, oh, okay, it means something. And if you say you don't want a cure, it means something. And yeah, I mean, I feel like if I were a listener and I don't have a disability, I'd be like, I can't say anything. You know, what can I say? You know, I can't win with this community. Right. And I think that it's so complicated, and each person is so unique in their reaction and response to disability, and just seeing that person is so challenging.
That's interesting. I think that's important. Like we want people to just be able to talk about this, and yeah, we don't want them to be afraid of what they're going to say. I took it on the other side of like, with a disability, I don't know how to talk about this, because are you going to overly pity me? Are you not going to believe me because I have a disability? Or are you going to use it as a weapon against me because I'm saying it's hard? Like, you know, I've realized with my hearing loss, I get so overwhelmed when I wear my hearing aids and it's like so loud and I hear so many noises that are just like super overwhelming for me. And so the idea of like, if you could just take a magic pill and it would be cured, maybe not. But I know a lot of people with disability that say that they wouldn't. You know, the big thing she said here was don't assume.
Yeah.
And maybe if we just take that as the message here, yeah, feel comfortable talking to people with disability. Just don't assume.
Yeah, I think that that's a good takeaway, is you can't assume.
Yeah.
Yesterday, you and I were in our Providence employee resource group meeting, and the topic was, what do you like about your disability? And I think that you can only have that conversation in a group of disabled people.
Oh, really?
I think so. Like the minute that you bring in someone who doesn't have a disability to the conversation, they're mapping all kinds of things onto that conversation that aren't there, right? They would push back on you. You know, they would say, what do you mean? What about this?
I'm going to push back on that, though, because are we making assumptions about somebody that's not disabled? I understand the importance of having a group that all has, you know, a similarity with having a disability. Like that was super powerful. It was my first time being there, and it was really healing and wonderful. I'm not sure I don't think that we should, include people that are not disabled, because that's not the point of the meeting. But I do think that, there's allies, there's advocates, and we need those people too.
Yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying. I think that these spaces need to exist for the sake of disabled people and our ability to connect with each other and be in community. And at the same time, I think that when and where people without disabilities can learn from our community, I think that's important too.
Yeah.
I think that change happens because of allyship and because we have those partnerships across the board. But yeah, I hear what you're saying. I mean, we can't make assumptions about what non-disabled people would do in that kind of a meeting. But I guess what I'll say is experience has kind of shown me otherwise, right?
Yeah.
In the disability community, we have this big problem with the word inspiration. Because a lot of times we'll say things like, oh, a lot of times people will say someone's inspiring just for doing basic stuff like brushing their teeth or going out for walks around the neighborhood. And it's like, that's not particularly inspiring. It's just me living my life. Right. But there's this wonderful advocate. Her name's Haben Girma, and she was the first deaf-blind graduate from Harvard Law School. And one of the things that she says is, I like to reframe that of what does it inspire you to do?
Right.
So when advocates and allies are inspired by us, disabled people, what are they inspired to do, right? Does it inspire you? And then you have to kind of interrogate that a little bit. Like, does it inspire you to brush your teeth in the morning? I mean, that's not super inspiring, but does it inspire you to push, for more accessible facilities within your workplace? That is inspiring.
Sarah, before we end this episode, I want to close out with one more conversation. It's between two friends, Casey Doherty and Courtney Milot. And in it, they discuss chronic illness, disability pride, and community. Here's Courtney Milot.
Yeah, I definitely would attribute a lot of my growth as identifying as someone with a disability to you, because you really helped me understand that there's a lot of power that comes from that label and that identity, and not just power, but community. So can you talk a little bit about coming to terms with that identity?
Yeah, I think, I always love hearing about how people come to terms with having disability as an identity, because I think it's different journeys for everyone. For me, I feel very comfortable identifying as disabled, and that wasn't a super hard transition for me. That being said, though, being a young person coming to terms with not expecting, what your body's going to be like and those sorts of things, I think can be very jarring, as it was for me. And I can talk a little bit about my specific disabilities. I am disabled by myalgic encephalomyelitis, or chronic fatigue syndrome, long COVID, tick-borne diseases similar to Lyme disease, and psychiatric disabilities. And I developed each of these at various times, but I've identified as disabled since right before I turned 20. I'm almost 26 now, so pretty much exactly 6 years. And like I said, I'm very comfortable, with the identity of being disabled. I'm actually proud to be disabled. And I think, Courtney, what you're talking about us growing together, I think a lot of that can be attributed to finding a really strong disability and chronic illness community, and learning that it's totally fine to be disabled. And it's actually usually better to own that identity if you're able to do so. And, some people don't choose to do that, and that's totally fine. But
yeah, there's definitely a privilege in being able to own that, yeah, I think.
For sure. And for me, actually, I think it may have even saved my life in terms of quickly understanding, well, not quick enough, but fairly quickly understanding things like pacing and radical rest, learning those things from, community elders and just people who have had these disabilities far longer than me, made it so that I wasn't getting even sicker when I might have otherwise. So I think that's a really big part of coming to terms with the identity, is finding that community. And I've also found that like it's hard to often identify with people who aren't disabled or aren't sick all the time or chronically ill. And so, you know, I find that those friendships tend to be a little deeper. Yeah. And the last thing I'll say about that is like, you know, I said I'm proud to be disabled, but multiple things can be true at once. Like I do sometimes wish that my body treated me a little differently. You know, and also having invisible and energy limiting disabilities come with their own unique set of challenges. You know, every person's embodied experience of disability is different. And for me, you know, with invisible and energy limiting disabilities, I'm often disbelieved and ignored when I seek care, and also just like kind of in every facet of society, which I know you also experience.
Well, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about some of your specific disabilities, because I know before our friendship, like you talked about ME, for example. So what is ME, and what are the particular challenges that you face with that disability?
Kind of starting at the beginning of the pandemic, I like started to hear about chronic fatigue syndrome, which, you know, kind of sounds like a euphemism. Like it's really not. It sounds like, oh, you're just tired, you know, but
if you hear chronic fatigue, you sort of look it up and you're like, oh, well, tired, maybe feel jet lagged. And that's not your reality at all. You're not just tired. Yeah. It's not like you pulled an all-nighter or, you know, you just had a rough night of sleep. This is bone deep fatigue.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, and for lots of people, you wake up one day sick and you never get better. And so it's often caused by a viral infection, like it was for me. So for me, it was COVID. And it tends to be so devastating that, and I like to share this statistic. So a quarter or more of people with ME are housebound or bedbound, and I generally fall in the housebound category. And approximately 75% of people with ME are unable to work. So, you know, that's just, I think, a devastating statistic. And it's also important to kind of position it in the present. I think it's critical for people to know about this because at this point, approximately 50% of people with long COVID also meet the criteria for ME. So, you know, it's appearing that a large percentage of people with long COVID, you know, may have ME the rest of their life. And so, like, you know, numbers are only going to continue to increase. And so I think it's getting harder and harder to ignore us. But part of, I think, the cruelty of this sort of disability is that we're pushed from public life. You know, I actually am on the mild to moderate end, which is like a little.
I remember when you told me that, and I was shocked, honestly, because my understanding of you, I mean, frankly, Casey, I mean, we're both in our 20s. You're probably one of the sickest people I know. And me as your friend, hearing that, I was shocked that you were on the mild to moderate end.
Yep. Yeah, it was shocking to me too. Like, you just don't, and that's the sad thing too, is like the people who are the sickest aren't able to share their stories. So it's like people only think, because, you know, I am still able to speak. Like, I'm not really able to like walk or like leave my home really at all. But like, you know, I am able, if I rest and those sorts of things, to share my story, which I'm very grateful for. But I think it also makes people think that like lots of people with this disability like can still do things. But it's just, it fluctuates so much across, you know, the whole population.
Thanks to our guests Casey Doherty and Courtney Milot. If you'd like to hear more from Crip Camp, it's available to view on streaming platforms, and a link to it is available on our website. Visit providence.org/1in5. That's 1 in 5, all words spelled out. And also get in touch with us if you are interested in sharing your experience of disability and healthcare. Thanks to our colleagues Deepak Sadagopan, Scott Acord, Sean Collins, and the Disability Caregiver Resource Group at Providence. I'm Sarah Quinto.
And I'm Angela Marith. In our next episode, we'll discuss why we need disability in our communities and how it strengthens us all. Thanks for listening. This is 1 in 5.